"If you answer correctly, I'll give you half the company," said the CEO to the janitor. David Miller had been cleaning the same hallways for 15 years and never imagined a simple question would change his life forever. On that early Tuesday morning, as he wiped down the main office of New York Metallurgy, he heard footsteps echoing through the empty corridor. It was almost 2 in the morning when the CEO unexpectedly appeared in the office. David felt his heart race. In all those years, he had never encountered Mr. Richard Thompson outside business hours. The man in the impeccable suit looked directly at him and uttered the words that would echo in his mind for days to come. "If you answer correctly, I'll give you half the company," said Richard with a seriousness David had never seen before. David stopped cleaning and stared at his boss in confusion. This had to be some kind of joke. A man like him, earning 2 minimum wages to support his family, would never be offered something like this. "Are you serious, Mr. Richard?" asked David, still holding the mop. "Dead serious. I need to know the full name of the first employee who worked here 40 years ago. If you know the answer, half of New York Metallurgy will be yours." David's legs trembled. He knew that answer better than anyone in the world. The company's first employee had been his own mother, Grace Miller Sullivan. She had passed away 20 years ago, taking with her stories about the early days of the metallurgy company that David had heard since childhood. But something about this situation didn't add up. Why him? Why now? David had learned from life that when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. "Mr. Richard, why are you asking me this?" David questioned, placing the mop back in the bucket. Richard avoided the question, walking to the window overlooking the factory yard. The machines were silent, but David could feel the tension in the air. "You have until dawn to give me the correct answer. Think carefully, David. Half of a company worth millions. Your life and your family's would never be the same again." The CEO left the room, leaving David alone with his thoughts. The janitor looked around the luxurious office with its imported furniture and expensive paintings on the walls. Could all of this really be his? But why was Richard making this offer? David finished his overnight shift with his mind racing. He arrived home in Queens still confused, finding his wife Jennifer preparing breakfast before heading to her job as a nursing assistant at City Hospital. "You look like you've seen a ghost," said Jennifer, pouring hot coffee. David told his wife everything. Jennifer listened in silence, stirring sugar into her cup with slow movements. When he finished, she let out a deep sigh. "David, this smells like a trap. Rich men don't just give things away like that out of nowhere." "I think it's strange too, Jen, but what if it's true? Think about our Emily. She could go to a private medical school, wouldn't have to kill herself studying to get into a state university." Emily was the couple's 18-year-old daughter, a bright girl who dreamed of becoming a doctor. She had secured a partial scholarship at a private college, but even so, the family was struggling to pay the tuition. "The answer is your mother's name, right?" asked Jennifer. "Yes. Grace Miller Sullivan. She always told me how she was one of the first people hired when the company was just starting." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing, Jennifer held her husband's hand across the kitchen table. They had built a simple but honest life. David had never missed a day of work, never taken anything that wasn't his, and always treated everyone with respect. "If you think you should answer, I support you. But be careful, love. Sometimes things come with a price we only discover later." David spent the day thinking about the offer. He couldn't sleep properly, tossing and turning in bed, imagining what it would be like to have enough money to give his family a better life. At the same time, a voice in his head said it was all too strange. The next night, he returned to work, still undecided. He began his usual cleaning routine on the lower floors, as he always did. When he reached the top floor, where the executive offices were, he found several boxes of old papers thrown in the hallway. Curiously, he noticed they were old company documents, yellowed papers, old contracts, employee records from the early years. David usually didn't touch company papers, but something caught his attention. Among the discarded documents, he found records of employees from the 1980s. Flipping through them carefully, he came across a folder with his mother's name. Grace Miller Sullivan, hired in March 1984, position administrative assistant. But there was something odd. On some documents, the name was crossed out, as if someone had tried to erase it. On others, the hiring date was different. David tucked a few papers into his bag, sensing something was wrong. When Richard showed up again around 2 in the morning, David was ready to confront him. "Mr. Richard, I found some strange things in the trash. Documents about my mother with conflicting information." Richard's face changed completely. His confidence gave way to an expression of worry. "What documents?" Richard asked, stepping closer. David showed him the papers he'd kept. Richard examined them carefully, and David could see sweat forming on the CEO's forehead. "David, I need you to understand something. I'm being blackmailed by a former partner. He claims he has rights to this company and is threatening to sue me. The only way to prove he's lying is through the testimony of the first employee. But my mother passed away 20 years ago, sir." "I know. That's why I need someone who can testify about her, about how the company started. You grew up hearing those stories." David felt there was more Richard wasn't telling him. He decided to push further. "And why did you choose me, of all people? You could have asked any long-time employee." Richard hesitated before answering. He walked to the leather chair behind the executive desk and sat down heavily. Because I promised your mother I'd look after you." David felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. "What do you mean?" "I knew your mother very well, David. She was more than just an employee. She was like a mother to me, too. When she got sick, in her last months, I visited her at the hospital. She made me promise I'd always watch over you." Richard stood and went to a cabinet, pulling out a small box. "All these years, I kept you employed not just for your work, but because of that promise. Your mother told me you were an honest, hard-working man who deserved a chance in life." David felt his eyes welling up. He'd never known his mother had a close relationship with the company's owner. "But why did she never tell me?" "Because she knew you had pride. She wanted you to make your own way without favors. But now with this situation with the former partner, I need your help." David looked again at the documents in his hands. There was still something that didn't add up. "Mr. Richard, these papers show someone tampered with my mother's records. Why?" The CEO sighed deeply, as if he'd been carrying a weight on his shoulders for years. "David, there's something you need to know. Your mother wasn't just the first employee. She was a founding partner of this company, alongside my father and another man." David nearly dropped the papers in his hands. "What?" "In the 1980s, your mother, my father Edward Thompson, and a man named Anthony Carter started this metallurgy business together. Each of them contributed part of the initial capital. Your mother mortgaged the house you lived in to invest in the business." David sat down in a chair, his legs weak. None of what he was hearing made sense compared to the stories he knew. "My mother was never a business owner. She always worked as an employee. She chose to leave the partnership after a few years. There were disagreements, financial troubles, and she decided to sell her share to my father. But she kept her job as a way to still be part of the company's growth." David looked around the luxurious office, thinking of the modest home he grew up in, the struggles his family always faced. "If she was a partner, why were we always short on money?" "Because she used the money from selling her shares to pay for your education, David. Your accounting college, remember? She gave up her fortune to invest in you." David remembered the years he spent attending night college while working during the day. His mother always found a way to pay the tuition, but he never questioned where the money came from. "So, what does this former partner have to do with it?" "Anthony Carter. He disappeared right after your mother left the partnership. Now, 40 years later, he's back, claiming he never sold his share, that my father deceived him. He has documents that seem to prove it." David began to grasp the complexity of the situation. "And you need to prove that my mother left the partnership willingly." "Exactly. She witnessed everything that happened, but she's gone now, and the only records we have were..." altered over the years. David looked again at the scribbled papers. By whom? Richard lowered his head. By me, David. I altered the documents years ago when I started fearing someone might uncover the original partnership. I thought it would be simpler if it looked like your mother had always just been an employee. David felt a mix of anger and disappointment. You lied about the company's history all these years? I was afraid, David. Afraid someone would challenge the company's ownership. My father left everything to me when he passed, but I knew there were unresolved issues. David stood up and began pacing the room. His mind was racing with all these revelations. And now, what does this Anthony Carter want? He wants 50% of the company. He claims he never got the money from selling his share and that he's entitled to half of everything built since then. And if he proves it, I lose the company, David, and with it, the jobs of over 200 families. David stopped in front of the window, looking out at the factory yard where so many people worked every day. He thought of the colleagues he'd known for years, the families who depended on those jobs. My mother kept a lot of old things at home, letters, documents, photos. Maybe there's something there that could help. Richard stood up quickly. Would you let me take a look? I don't know, Mr. Richard. I'm still trying to make sense of all this. You're asking me to dig through my mother's things to save a company she helped build, but was practically erased from. David, I understand your anger, but think of the employees, the families who depend on this place. David knew Richard was right about that, but he also felt there were more secrets behind this whole story. I'll go home and get my mother's things, but I want something in return. Anything you want. I want the complete truth. Everything that happened between your family and mine. Don't leave anything out. Richard nodded. David left the company with mixed feelings. On one hand, he was uncovering a part of his family's history he'd never known. On the other, he felt there were still missing pieces to the puzzle. When he got home, he found Jennifer awake in the living room waiting for him. So? Did you give him your answer? No, Jen. It's much more complicated than it seemed. David told his wife everything he had discovered. Jennifer listened in silence, her expressions shifting from surprise to indignation. You mean your mother was a partner in $1 million company and never told us? Seems that way. And she used her money to pay for my education. Jennifer stood up and went to the bedroom, returning with an old cardboard box. These are the things left from your mother. You never wanted to go through them, but maybe now's the time. David looked at the box that had been stored at the top of the closet all these years. He'd always said he'd go through it when he was ready, but the moment never seemed right. He opened the box slowly. Inside were old photos, letters, documents, a small diary, and some simple jewelry. David picked up the letters first. Many were from friends, some from distant relatives, but one stack caught his attention. They were letters embossed with the name New York Metallurgy, dated from the 1980s. He carefully opened the first one. Dear Grace, thank you for understanding our decision. I know it wasn't easy to accept leaving the partnership, but as we discussed, it will be better for everyone. Your son will have a bright future with the education you'll be able to afford. Edward. David read the letter twice. It was signed by Richard's father, confirming his mother had indeed been a partner in the company. Jen, look at this, he said, showing the letter to his wife. Jennifer read it aloud. Your son will have a bright future with the education you'll be able to afford. Your mother really gave up everything for you, David. David kept sifting through the correspondence. He found more letters, some from Anthony Carter, the former partner who was causing trouble. Grace, I can't accept Edward's decision. He's forcing us out of the company we helped build. You need to reconsider your position. Anthony. Another letter dated a week later. Grace, Edward offered me money to leave the partnership, but I suspect something's wrong. He doesn't want me to see the accounting books. If you've already signed the papers, at least keep copies of everything. Anthony. David felt a chill in his stomach. It seemed there really was something suspicious about the original partners leaving the company. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. He kept digging through the box and found a folder with official documents, contracts, deeds, payment receipts. and in the middle of it all, a birth certificate that made David stop breathing for a moment. It wasn't his birth certificate. It was for someone named David Carter Miller. The name Carter was there, but had been crossed out and replaced with just Miller. "Jen, look at this," he said, showing the document to his wife. Jennifer examined it carefully. "David, this is really strange. Why would you have the last name Carter on your original birth certificate?" David kept searching the box for more clues. At the bottom, he found a sealed envelope with a letter that had never been opened. On the envelope was written, "For David, when you're ready for the truth." With trembling hands, David opened the envelope. The letter was in his mother's handwriting. "My dear son, if you're reading this, it's finally time for you to know the whole truth. Anthony Carter wasn't just my business partner. He was your father." David let the letter fall to the floor. Jennifer picked it up and continued reading aloud, her voice trembling. "Anthony and I loved each other, but he was married. When I found out I was pregnant with you, he promised he'd leave his wife, but he never had the courage. Edward Thompson always knew the truth and helped me so much during your childhood." David sank heavily onto the couch, trying to process everything he was learning. The business partnership worked well in the early years, but when you were born, things got complicated. Anthony wanted to acknowledge you as his son, but I wouldn't allow it. I didn't want you growing up knowing your father had abandoned you both. Jennifer kept reading. "Edward started pressuring us to leave the partnership. He said the situation was hurting the business. I agreed to sell my shares, but Anthony refused. There were many fights, and one day he just disappeared." David looked again at the altered birth certificate. Now it all made sense. "Edward told me Anthony had sold his shares and left town. We never heard from him again. I used the money from selling my shares to pay for your education because I wanted you to have the opportunities your father and I never had." The letter ended with, "If Anthony ever returned, as I always feared he might, know that he is your biological father, but you owe him nothing. Edward Thompson was more of a father to you than he ever was. With all my love, Grace." David sat in silence for several minutes. Jennifer sat beside him and took his hand. "Honey, are you okay?" "I don't know, Jen. In one night, I found out my mother was a businesswoman, that the CEO of the company I work for knew my whole story, and that my biological father is the very man trying to take over the company. What are you going to do?" David looked at all the documents spread across the living room table. Letters, contracts, old photos. Here was the proof of everything that had happened 40 years ago. "First, I'm going back there to tell Richard everything. After that, I don't know. I need to think about whether I want to meet this Anthony Carter." David gathered all the documents into a folder and returned to the company. He found Richard still in the office, clearly nervous and anxious. "Did you find anything?" Richard asked as soon as David walked in. "I found much more than I expected," David replied, placing the folder on the desk. "Starting with the fact that Anthony Carter is my father." Richard turned pale. "Did you know?" "No. I found out tonight. My mother left a letter explaining everything." David showed all the documents to Richard, who examined them carefully. When he finished reading, Richard leaned back in his chair, looking defeated. "David, I'm so sorry about all this. Your father, Anthony, he really had rights to the company. My father deceived him." "What do you mean?" "Anthony never willingly sold his shares. My father forced him out by creating humiliating situations for him at the company. He threatened to tell Anthony's wife about his relationship with your mother and about you." David felt anger rising in his chest. "So, your father blackmailed mine?" "Yes. And when Anthony refused to sign the papers, my father forged his signature. I only found out a few years ago while organizing the company's old documents." "And why didn't you ever do anything?" "Because I was afraid. The company had grown so much, employing hundreds of people. I didn't even know if Anthony was still alive. I thought maybe he'd never come back." David walked to the window, looking out at the city as it began to wake. The sun was rising and he had to give Richard an answer. "And now?" "Anthony is back and wants what's rightfully his." "It's not quite that simple," said Richard. He doesn't just want the money, he wants to take control of the company. He said he'll fire all the long-time employees and modernize everything. More than 200 families will lose their jobs. David turned to face Richard. How do you know this? Because he already came here to talk to me. He made an offer. Either I sell my share to him below market value, or he'll take legal action and prove my father stole the company from him. And if he proves it in court, he'll be entitled to 50% of the company's current value, plus all the profits from the last 40 years. It would be an amount I couldn't pay even if I sold everything. David sat back down across from Richard. So you'd really lose everything? Yes, and the worst part is he's right. My father really did steal his share. David fell silent, thinking about everything he'd uncovered. His mother, a simple woman he'd always seen struggling to pay the bills, had been a business owner. His biological father, whom he'd never met, was a man who'd been deceived and forced out of his own company. David, I know I have no right to ask this, but would you be willing to talk to Anthony? Maybe you two can find a solution that doesn't hurt the employees. I don't know if I want to meet him, said David. He may be my biological father, but he abandoned my mother when she was pregnant. According to the letters you brought, it seems the situation was more complicated than that. Maybe it's worth hearing his side. David knew Richard was right. There were too many loose ends in this story, and perhaps only by talking to Anthony could he truly understand what had happened. All right, but I want you there for the conversation. Of course, I'll call him now. Richard picked up the phone and dialed a number. David only heard one side of the conversation, but could tell Anthony agreed to meet them that same morning. He'll be here at 10, Richard said after hanging up. David checked the clock. 3 hours to go. I'll go home to get ready and talk to my family. I'll be back before 10. David, one more thing. About the offer I made yesterday. Half the company. The offer still stands. No matter what happens with Anthony, you're the son of one of the original founders. You have a right to a share of all this. David shook his head. Let's deal with this situation with my father first. Then we can talk about rights and inheritance. David returned home to find Jennifer and Emily having coffee in the kitchen. His daughter, an 18-year-old with sharp eyes and big dreams, could tell something had changed in her father. Dad, you look like you didn't sleep all night. Did something happen at work? David looked at Emily and felt his heart tighten. In just a few hours, she might learn she had a grandfather she'd never known, that her family history was completely different from what she'd always believed. Emily, I need to talk to you and your mum about some things in our family you don't know. David told Emily everything. The young woman listened quietly, asking pointed questions, processing each piece of information with the maturity she'd always shown. So my grandmother was a business owner and never told us? Emily asked. It seems so. And that you have a living grandfather I've never met. Emily was thoughtful for a moment. Dad, are you meeting him today? I am. I'm nervous, but I think I need to know the whole truth. Can I come with you? David and Jennifer exchanged glances. Emily, maybe it's better if... Dad, if he's my grandfather, I have a right to meet him too. Besides, you might need support. David smiled for the first time since this all began. His daughter had always been brave and determined, traits she'd surely inherited from her grandmother. All right, but be prepared. We don't know how he'll react when he finds out he has a granddaughter. The three of them got ready and went together to the company. They arrived 15 minutes before 10. Richard greeted them in the office, visibly nervous. David, are you sure you want your family present for this conversation? I do. If we're going to resolve family matters, it's better if everyone is involved. At exactly 10 o'clock, the secretary announced the arrival of Anthony Carter. David felt his stomach twist. In just a few seconds, he would meet the man who had fathered him, but never raised him. Anthony entered the room and David was stunned. The man, around 65 years old, had features strikingly similar to his own, the same facial structure, the same brown eyes, the same shape of his hands. Anthony looked directly at David and stopped walking. David? Yes. Anthony approached slowly, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. You look just like Grace. Was she... well, when... She passed away 20 years ago, David said. She never told me about you. Anthony lowered his head. I figured she wouldn't. Grace was always too proud to accept help from someone who hurt her. This is my wife Jennifer and my daughter Emily, David said, trying to keep his voice steady. Anthony looked at Emily with tear-filled eyes. My granddaughter. I never thought I'd live to meet my granddaughter. Emily stepped closer to her grandfather. Grandpa, why did you never look for my dad? Anthony sank heavily into a chair. Because I thought it was for the best. I was married, had other children. When your father was born, Grace made it clear she wanted nothing to do with me. But you could have insisted, David said. I could have, but I was young and cowardly. I thought it would be easier to disappear and let you rebuild your lives. Richard, who had stayed silent until then, intervened. Anthony, David has uncovered the whole truth about what happened to the company. He knows my father deceived you. Anthony looked at Richard with a mix of anger and sadness. 40 years, Richard. For 40 years, I thought my partners had betrayed me for money. Only recently did I discover your father forged my signature. How did you find out? David asked. A former employee of the company reached out to me last year. He had kept copies of old documents and noticed the irregularities. That's when I decided to investigate and learned what really happened. David pulled the letters he had found at home from his briefcase. My mother kept correspondence from that time. There are letters from you expressing suspicions about Richard's father. Anthony read the letters carefully. Your mother was always sharp. She suspected something was wrong before I did. Why do you want to take control of the company? Emily asked. Why not just accept the money? Anthony smiled for the first time since arriving. Your granddaughter gets straight to the point, doesn't she? Just like her grandmother. Answer the question, Emily insisted, because it's not just about money, Emily, it's about justice. All these years, the company I helped build grew using ideas I developed. I want to prove that a simple man like me can also run a successful business. David understood his father's feelings. But do you realize you could end up costing many families their jobs? I don't intend to fire anyone. I plan to modernize the company, make it more efficient. Some employees may be reassigned, but no one will be left unemployed. Richard stood up. Anthony, what if we make a deal? David is your son and Grace's grandson. He has moral rights to part of this company. What if we split everything equally 3 ways? Anthony looked at David. What do you think, son? David had never been called son by Anthony before. The word sounded strange, but it carried an emotional weight he hadn't expected. I don't know. I've always worked as an employee. I know nothing about running businesses. But you studied accounting, right? Asked Anthony. Your mother always told me you were very smart with numbers. David was surprised. You talked to my mother? Occasionally. She'd call me from time to time to tell me how you were doing. I never stopped loving your mother, David. And I never stopped caring about you. Jennifer, who had been quiet until then, asked a question that had been bothering David. Mr. Anthony, do you have other children? I have 2 children from my marriage. They know about David and would love to meet him. David felt a mix of curiosity and apprehension. How long have they known? They've always known. My ex-wife and I separated a few years after David was born. It wasn't because of Grace. Our marriage was already failing. But the situation made things worse. Emily moved closer to her grandfather. Grandpa, do you really want to keep the company? Or do you just want people to acknowledge you were wronged? Anthony laughed. You're very sharp, young lady. What hurts me most is that no one remembers I helped build all this. For 40 years, I was erased from the company's history. David had an idea. What if we created a memorial about the real history of the company? Put a plaque at the entrance telling the story of the true founders, including you and my mother. That doesn't solve the legal issue, said Richard. No, but it solves the emotional one, David replied. My father wants recognition as much as he wants money. Anthony grew thoughtful. What about the financial side? David looked at Richard. You said yesterday you'd give me half the company if I answered your question. The answer is Grace Miller Sullivan, but I don't want half of anything built on injustice. What do you propose then? Richard asked. That we reorganize everything fairly. My father deserves the share that was taken from him, adjusted for 40 years of profits. That probably amounts to about 30% of the company today. And the other 70%? Anthony asked. Stays with Richard, who managed and grew the business all these years. But I'll accept a role as CFO to learn and get involved in management. Richard smiled. David, you really have a talent for negotiation. Anthony, what do you think of the proposal? Anthony looked at David with pride. I accept, but on one condition. What? Richard and David asked together. I want Emily to have a full medical school scholarship paid by the company. And when she graduates, if she wants, she'll have a guaranteed position as the plant physician at New York Metallurgy. Emily nearly jumped for joy. Really, Grandpa? Really? Your grandmother Grace always dreamed of the family having a doctor. I think she'd be happy knowing we made that dream come true. David felt his eyes well up. Anthony, Dad, I'll meet my half-brothers, and I'll let you be part of our lives if you want. Anthony stood and hugged David for the first time. Son, I'm so sorry for all those lost years. I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to fight for you and your mother when I was younger. The past is gone, David said, but we can build a better future. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. Richard called the company lawyer to draft the new contracts. While they waited, Anthony told David about his other children and his life during the 40 years they'd been apart. After I left the company, I tried several businesses. I worked as a sales rep, ran a small auto repair shop, and eventually started a transportation company. I didn't get rich, but I lived well. And why did you come back now? Jennifer asked. Because the injustice always bothered me, and because when I found out David was working here, I wanted to find a way to make up for all the lost time without being intrusive. Make up how? David asked. By making sure you had the right to what was always yours by inheritance. Your mother invested in the company just as much as I did. You both deserve a share of the fruits of that. The lawyer arrived, and they began discussing the legal details of the agreement. Anthony would receive 30% of the company, acknowledging his original stake plus adjustments. David would become the financial director and receive 10% of the shares as recognition of his mother's rights. Richard would retain 60% and remain as CEO. Wait, Richard said. What if Anthony's other children claim inheritance rights? They won't, Anthony replied. I've already spoken to them about it. They have their own lives and businesses. They support my decision to recognize David as the heir to my share. For the rest of the day, they settled all the details. The company would be restructured, with new investments in equipment and employee training. Emily would receive a full scholarship, and David would start working part-time in administration, while continuing his duties as a janitor supervisor, until he felt ready to fully take on the role of director. When everything was nearly resolved, David asked a question that had been bothering him. Dad, are you sure you really want to publicly acknowledge me as your son? This will affect your reputation. It'll stir up your family. Anthony held his son's hand. David, for 40 years, I lived with the regret of not fighting for you. I won't waste a second chance to have you in my life. And your ex-wife? How did she react when she found out you were going to look for me? She supported me, said I should have done it a long time ago. You know, David, she always knew about you, and that was never the problem in our marriage. Our issues were different. By late afternoon, when all the papers were signed and the agreements finalized, David realized that in less than 24 hours, his life had completely changed. From a janitor, he'd become the financial director of a company worth millions. From a fatherless orphan, he'd gained not just a father, but 2 half-siblings. His daughter now had college secured and a promising professional future. But what moved him most was discovering that his mother, the simple woman he'd always admired, had been a visionary entrepreneur who gave up a fortune to invest in his education. David, Richard said, you still haven't given me the official answer to the question I asked yesterday. What was the full name of the company's first employee? David smiled. Grace Miller Sullivan. But she wasn't just the first employee. She was one of the founders, a visionary, a mother who sacrificed everything for her son's future, and a woman who deserves to be remembered in this company's history. And she will be, Anthony said. We'll create a memorial for her in the company's entrance hall." That night, David went home accompanied by Anthony, who stayed for dinner with the family. Emily couldn't stop asking questions of her newly discovered grandfather, and Jennifer worked hard to prepare a special meal. "Dad," Emily said during dinner, "I want to meet my uncles." "They want to meet you too," Anthony replied. "How about we arrange lunch next Sunday?" David agreed. "But I want you all to know I'll take it slow. 40 years can't be made up in a few weeks." "Of course, son. We have time now." After dinner, when Anthony had left, David and Jennifer stayed talking in the living room. "Can you believe everything that happened today?" Jennifer asked. "No, it feels like a dream. Yesterday I was a janitor worried about paying the bills. Today I'm the director of a company, and I have a father who appeared out of nowhere." "And how do you feel about all this?" David thought before answering. "Confused, happy, anxious, sad that my mother isn't here to see it? So many things at once." "Do you think your mother would approve of your decisions today?" "I think so. She always taught me to be fair, honest, to consider the consequences of my actions for others. That's what I tried to do today." Jennifer held her husband's hand. "I'm proud of you. Many men in your position would have only thought about the money. You thought about family, the employees, justice." "I learned from her," said David, looking at his mother's photo on the wall. "I always learned from her." The following week, David began dividing his time between cleaning duties and learning the company's financial management. Richard accompanied him to meetings, explaining spreadsheets and introducing suppliers and clients. "You really have a knack for this," Richard said after a particularly complex meeting. "Your mother would be proud." "You really knew my mother well, didn't you?" David asked. "I did. She was an impressive woman, smart, determined, brave. When she decided to leave the partnership to focus on her studies, I tried to convince her to stay. I said we could find other ways to pay for her college." "And why didn't she accept?" "Because she said she wanted you to make your own way without privileges, that it would be better for you to learn to fight for what you wanted than to have everything handed to you." David smiled. That was exactly the kind of thing his mother would say. Anthony also started visiting the company regularly, contributing his transportation expertise to improve product delivery logistics. The long-time employees remembered him from the early days and welcomed him warmly. "Mr. Anthony was always a good man," said Mrs. Grace, a 60-year-old employee who had worked there for 30 years. "When he disappeared overnight, everyone was surprised." "And what did you think had happened?" David asked. "We thought he'd fought with the partners over money. We never imagined he'd been deceived." David realized the employee's version of the company's history was completely different from the truth. He decided it was important to set the record straight. With Richard and Anthony's approval, he organized a meeting with all the employees to share the real story of the company's founding. He explained about his mother, about Anthony, about the deceptions of the past, and their plans for the future. "The company will improve for all of us," David told the employees gathered in the factory yard. "We'll invest in new equipment, training, better working conditions, and we'll honor the memory of everyone who helped build this place." The employees welcomed the changes enthusiastically. Many approached David after the meeting to praise his transparency and honesty. A week after the agreement, the day arrived for David to have lunch with his half-brothers. Anthony chose a restaurant in the city center, and David was accompanied by Jennifer and Emily. The brothers, Charles and Edward, the latter named after their grandfather, were men in their early 40s, successful in their respective careers, Charles as an engineer and Edward as a lawyer. "Finally, we meet our big brother," Charles said, hugging David. "Dad always talked about you," Edward added, "said you were a lot like him when he was young." David felt welcomed by his brothers. They talked about their lives, how they'd grown up knowing they had a brother they'd never met, and how they'd always hoped the family would reunite someday. "Don't you feel wronged by this whole company situation?" asked David. "No way," said Charles. "Dad was wronged, and you have the right to what should have always been yours. Besides, we have our own lives and careers." "And we're happy to have a niece," said Edward, smiling at Emily. "She can count on us for anything." Emily was delighted with her uncles. Dad, why did it take us so long to meet them? Because sometimes life is complicated, sweetheart. But what matters is that now we're a family. During lunch, David noticed that, despite the lost years, there was a natural connection between them. The brothers had similar mannerisms, shared ways of seeing the world, and common family values. "David," said Anthony during dessert, "I'd like to ask you something." "Of course, Dad. I'd like you to consider changing your last name to David Carter Miller, not to erase your mother's memory, but to honor our family too." David looked at Jennifer, who nodded in agreement. "I accept, Dad, but on one condition." "What?" "That Emily also gets to choose if she wants to use the Carter name. I'll leave the decision up to her." Emily smiled. "I want to, Dad. Emily Carter Miller sounds nice, don't you think?" Everyone laughed, and David felt he finally had the big family he'd always wanted. 3 months later, New York Metallurgy was transformed. New equipment had been installed, employees had received training, and productivity had increased significantly. David was doing well as the financial director. He discovered he had a real talent for numbers and strategic planning. The company was achieving its best results ever. "You've exceeded all my expectations," said Richard during a board meeting. "Your mother would be so proud." "I still feel like an imposter sometimes," David admitted. "I still think like a janitor, not a director." "And that's a good thing," said Anthony, "because you understand the employees in a way we never did. You know the real problems of the company, not just the numbers." Emily had started medical college and was loving it. She often visited the company to get to know the environment where she might one day work. "Dad, I really want to specialize in occupational medicine," she said one afternoon. "I want to help take care of the employees' health." "Your grandmother would be proud," said David. "She always said she wanted a doctor in the family." That same week, David received an unexpected call. It was from a journalist interested in writing about the family and the company's story. "Mr. David, we heard about your family's story and would like to do a feature on how the truth came out after 40 years. David spoke with Richard and Anthony before deciding. "What do you think?" "I think it could be interesting," said Richard. "The story is inspiring. It might motivate others to seek the truth about past injustices." "And it could honor your mother's memory," added Anthony. David agreed to the interview. The article was published a few weeks later, titled "The Janitor Who Discovered He Was the Heir to a Fortune and Chose Justice." The story had a big impact, and David received messages from people all over the country who related to his story. Many shared their own unresolved family injustices, stories of abandoned children, or denied inheritances. "I never thought our story could inspire others," David said to Jennifer. "It's because you all made the right choices. It could have turned into an ugly legal battle full of hate and resentment, but you chose dialogue and justice." 6 months after the first meeting with Richard in the office, the company inaugurated the Grace Miller Sullivan Memorial in the entrance hall. A bronze plaque told the true story of the company's founding, honoring all the original founders. At the inauguration, all the employees, David's family, and several members of the community were present. David gave an emotional speech. "My mother always taught me that the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than a lie. She gave up a fortune to invest in my education, believing knowledge was more valuable than money. Today, we honor not only her memory, but the values she taught me: honesty, hard work, and always thinking of the common good." After the speech, David was approached by several people. One in particular caught his attention, a woman around 70 years old who came forward with tears in her eyes. "Mr. David, my name is Rose. I worked with your mother in the early years of the company. Mrs. Rose, my mother spoke of you often. I wanted you to know that your mother was deeply respected by all of us. When she left the partnership, we were very sad, but she always said she was doing it for her son's future. Did you know she was a partner?" "Yes, we did. But she asked us not to tell anyone. She didn't want you growing up feeling different because of it." David hugged Mrs. Rose. "Thank you for telling me this. It's important to know others remember her fondly. She would be so happy seeing you here today, honoring her memory and doing the right thing." That evening, after the inauguration, David was at home with his family when the phone rang. It was Richard. "David, did you see the orders that came in today?" "I did. Why?" "They're the largest in the company's history. It seems the story about our past has caught the attention of new clients. They want to work with a company that has strong values." David smiled. "My mother always said doing the right thing pays off in the end." She was right. The company has never been better. After hanging up, David sat in the living room and looked at the photo of his mother on the wall. Emily was studying at the kitchen table. Jennifer was watching TV on the couch, and he finally felt at peace. His life had changed completely, but the values his mother had taught him remained the same. Work hard, treat everyone with respect, always strive to do what's right. "Dad," Emily said, looking up from her books, "do you regret anything that's happened these past few months?" David thought about the question. "No, sweetheart. I regret the years we lost without knowing your grandfather and uncles. But I don't regret any of the decisions we made. And you? Me neither. I'm proud of you, Dad. You had the chance to be greedy and chose to be fair. I learned from your grandmother," David said, looking again at Grace's photo. "I always learned from her." A year later, David had fully adjusted to his role as financial director. The company continued to grow, the employees were happy, and the family was united. Anthony had become a present and loving father, making up for lost years with dedication and affection. David's half-brothers had become close friends, and the families visited each other regularly. Emily was in her second year of medical school with excellent grades. She was already doing volunteer work at the company, getting to know the employees and understanding their occupational health needs. "Dad," Emily said one afternoon, "I have an idea." "What is it, sweetheart?" "How about we create a daycare for the employees' children? Many mothers struggle to work because they have nowhere to leave their kids." David discussed the idea with Richard and Anthony, who approved it immediately. The daycare was built on a plot of land next to the factory, with qualified teachers and all the necessary facilities. "Your daughter thinks like a businesswoman," Richard said to David at the daycare opening. "She thinks like her grandmother," David corrected. "Always thinking about people's well-being." 2 years after that early morning when it all began, David received an unexpected invitation. A local college wanted him to give a talk on business ethics and social responsibility. "I'm not an academic," David told the dean who had invited him. "I'm just a man who tried to do the right things." "That's exactly why we want you to speak to our students. They need real examples of how to apply human values in the business world." David accepted the invitation. On the day of the talk, the auditorium was packed with students majoring in business, accounting, and economics. "2 years ago, I was a janitor," David began. "Today, I'm the CFO of a company worth millions. But what changed in my life wasn't just the title or the money. It was understanding that any professional success not built on solid values is temporary and empty." David told the students the whole story. He spoke about his mother, the discoveries he made, and the tough choices he had to face. "You might think I was naive, that I could have kept a lot more money if I'd been smarter. But I learned one thing. When you sleep peacefully at night, knowing you did the right thing, that's worth more than any fortune." After the talk, several students approached David with questions and comments. One young woman stood out to him. "Professor David, my father abandoned our family when I was little. He owns a company now and never helped us financially. Your story gives me hope that justice might still be done someday." David spoke at length with the student, advising her on how to pursue her rights peacefully and fairly. "Remember," David said, "the goal shouldn't be revenge but justice. And justice benefits everyone, even those who caused the injustice in the first place." On his way home after the talk, David reflected on how much his life had changed. It wasn't just about having more money or a better position. It was about discovering his true identity, reclaiming a family, and honoring his mother's memory. That evening, he had dinner with Jennifer, Emily, and Anthony, who had become a constant presence in the house. They talked about the company's plans, Emily's studies, and life in general. "Dad," Emily said, Do you remember the question Mr. Richard asked that first night? Of course. What was the full name of the company's first employee 40 years ago? What if he'd asked something you didn't know? How would our lives be different today? David laughed. I'd probably still be a janitor, you'd be struggling to pay for college, and I'd never have met my father. Do you think it was a coincidence he asked exactly that question? David looked at Anthony, who smiled mysteriously. Dad, did you have something to do with this? Anthony chuckled. Maybe. When I found out you worked at the company, I spoke to Richard on the phone a few times. I told him I wanted to find a way to reconcile with you without being intrusive. So you two planned that whole situation? Not exactly. The blackmail issue was real, but Richard had the idea of using it as an opportunity to reveal the whole truth. We thought you deserved to know about your family history. David shook his head, smiling. You tricked me. We gave you a chance, Anthony corrected. The choice of how to react was all yours, and you chose honesty and justice. Like my mother taught me, David said. Like she taught all of us, Anthony agreed. 3 years after that first night, the company New York Metallurgy was considered a model in social responsibility. In addition to the daycare for employees' children, they had created an adult literacy program, a comprehensive health plan, and a support fund for employees facing financial difficulties. David had become a respected and recognized director in the industry. He received several invitations for lectures and consulting work, but he always prioritized his role in the family business. Emily was in her 4th year of medical school, already doing internships in occupational medicine. She had ambitious plans for after graduation. Dad, when I graduate, I want to implement a complete occupational health program at the company. Not just employee checkups, but prevention programs, exercise, healthy eating. Your grandmother would be proud, David said. She always dreamed of having a doctor in the family, and you're going to be a doctor who truly makes a difference. Anthony, now 68 years old, had formally retired from the business but still visited the company as an informal consultant. He was beloved by all the employees who saw him as a father figure. David, Anthony said one afternoon, I want to propose something to you. What is it, Dad? How about we write a book about our story? It could help other families who've gone through similar situations. David liked the idea. But I don't know how to write. We can hire someone to help. The important thing is to tell the story, to show that it's possible to resolve family and business conflicts without hatred or revenge. David discussed the book idea with Jennifer and Emily. Both enthusiastically supported it. It'll be a way to honor Grandma's memory forever, Emily said. And it might inspire others to seek truth and justice, Jennifer added. The book was written in collaboration with a journalist specializing in family stories. It took 8 months to complete and was published under the title, The Question That Changed Everything, a story of family, forgiveness, and justice. The book became a bestseller, especially among people who had experienced complex family situations. David donated all royalties to organizations helping families in vulnerable circumstances. At the book launch party, held in the company's auditorium, employees, family, friends, and many who had been inspired by David's story were present. When that question was asked 4 years ago, David said in his speech, I thought I was being tested on my knowledge. Today I understand I was being tested on my values. The right answer wasn't just a name. It was choosing to do the right thing, even when it meant giving up personal advantages. After the launch, David received hundreds of messages from readers. Many shared similar stories of family injustices, resolved through dialogue and the pursuit of truth. One letter in particular moved him deeply. It was from a 50-year-old woman who had reconciled with her father after reading the book. Mr. David, your story gave me the courage to reach out to my father after 20 years of silence. We discovered we'd both been carrying grudges based on misunderstandings. Today, we're a family again. Thank you for showing it's never too late to make things right. Dad, Emily said after David read the letter aloud to the family, do you realize how many people you've helped? It was your grandmother who helped, David replied. I just followed the lessons she left me. No, Anthony said. Grace planted the seed, but you chose to let it grow. You could have chosen resentment, greed, revenge, but you chose forgiveness and justice. Because I learned that holding on to anger hurts us more than the people we're angry with, said David. 5 years after that first conversation in the office, David had established himself as the financial director and natural successor to Richard as CEO of the company. New York Metallurgy had become one of the most respected in the region, not just for the quality of its products, but for how it treated employees and the community. Emily had graduated from medical school and was specializing in occupational medicine just as she had planned. She had already implemented several health programs at the company and had plans to expand the model to other businesses in the area. The family had grown too. Charles, one of David's half-brothers, had moved to the city and was working as an engineer at the company. Edward visited often with his family, and Emily's cousins had become close friends. "David," Richard said during a board meeting, "the time has come for us to start thinking about my succession. I'm 65 and would like to retire gradually." "I'm honored by your trust," David replied, "but are you sure? There's still so much I can learn." "You've already learned the most important things," Richard said. "You've learned to lead with ethics, to make decisions for the common good, and to treat people with respect. The rest is just technical details." Anthony supported the succession. "You're ready, son, and you'll always have our help whenever you need it." David gradually accepted taking on more responsibilities as CEO. One of the first things he did was create an advisory board with employee representatives to ensure decisions always considered everyone's interests. "I want this company to remain a place where people are treated like family," David said in his first meeting as interim CEO. 6 months later, David officially became the CEO of New York Metallurgy. At the inauguration ceremony, he made sure his mother's memorial was decorated with fresh flowers. "Mom," David whispered silently before the bronze plaque, "we did it. The company you helped build is in good hands, and it's still a place where people are treated with dignity and respect." During the celebration, David was surprised by an unexpected tribute. The employees had prepared a video with testimonials about how his leadership had changed the work environment. "David is different from any boss we've ever had," Mrs. Rose said in the video. "He understands our struggles because he's been in our shoes. He's never forgotten where he came from. He turned this company into one big family," another employee added. "Here, we're not just a number on a paycheck. We're people with dreams and struggles, and he cares about that." David was moved by the tributes. "You know you can always count on me," he told the employees. "This company only matters if it's a good place for all of us." 2 years after becoming CEO, David received a call that would change his perspective on life and work once again. It was from a New York businessman who had read his book and wanted to propose a partnership to expand New York Metallurgy's management model to other companies. "Mr. David, your way of running things is delivering impressive results. I'd like to discuss the possibility of you consulting for other companies that want to implement similar models." David discussed the proposal with his family and partners. "What do you all think?" "I think it could be a way to honor Grandma's memory even more," Emily said, "spreading the values she taught you. And it could help many other working families," Jennifer added. Anthony and Richard also supported the idea. "You've built something special here," said Richard. "It's worth sharing with others." David accepted the proposal, but with clear conditions. The consulting would only be offered to companies truly committed to improving working conditions and employee relations. "We don't want to work with companies that just want to improve their image without changing their core," said David. The consulting became highly sought after. Within 3 years, David and his team helped over 50 companies implement more humane and ethical management models. Emily, who had completed her specialization, became a partner in the firm, focusing on occupational health and employee well-being. "Dad, it's amazing how small changes in how people are treated can completely transform a company," Emily said after a particularly successful consultation. "Your grandmother always said treating people well costs nothing, but makes all the difference," David replied. 10 years after that first question in the office, David was in his CEO office when he received an unexpected visitor. It was a young man around 20, nervous and clearly anxious. "Mr. David, My name is Gabriel Carter. I'm your nephew." David looked at the young man in surprise. "Nephew? I'm the son of Edward, one of your half-brothers. He told me to come to you because I'm going through a situation similar to what you faced." David invited Gabriel to sit and offered him coffee. "Tell me what's happening." Gabriel explained he had recently discovered his maternal grandfather had been a partner in a company now worth a fortune, but his family had never received anything because the documents had been altered. "My father said you could advise me on what to do," Gabriel said. David listened carefully to the whole story. "Gabriel, the first thing you need to understand is that seeking justice isn't the same as seeking revenge. What's your real goal?" "I want them to acknowledge my grandfather was wronged, and for my family to receive what's rightfully ours." "And are you willing to pursue this through dialogue, or do you want to jump straight into a legal battle?" Gabriel thought about the question. "I'd prefer dialogue, but what if they refuse to talk?" "Then you present the evidence you have and seek justice through legal means, but always offer the chance to resolve things amicably first." David spent hours talking with Gabriel, sharing his experience and giving practical advice on how to handle the situation. "Remember," David said at the end of their conversation, "the goal isn't to destroy anyone. It's to achieve justice in a way that benefits everyone." Gabriel followed his uncle's advice and managed to resolve the situation peacefully, securing his family's rights without going to court. "Uncle David," Gabriel said a few months later, "we did it. The company acknowledged our family's rights and offered fair compensation. And the best part, they want to hire our consulting firm to improve their management." David smiled. "When you do things right, Gabriel, the results are always positive for everyone." 15 years after that first question, David was at the peak of his career. New York Metallurgy was considered a national model for humane management. The consulting firm served companies across the country. The book had sold over 100,000 copies and been translated into other languages. But what made David proudest was seeing how his family had grown and strengthened. Emily was a respected and successful doctor. Anthony, now 73, was a loving and present grandfather. His half-siblings had become lifelong partners. "Dad," Emily said one afternoon, "I have some news to share." "What is it, sweetheart?" "I'm pregnant. You're going to be a grandfather." David felt his eyes well up. "Really?" "Really. And we already know it's a girl. We want to name her Grace." David hugged his daughter tightly. "Your grandmother would have been so happy." "Dad, I want my daughter to grow up knowing her great-grandmother's story. I want her to know that strong, honest women can change the world." "You can be sure she will," David said, "and she'll grow up in a family that values honesty, hard work, and justice." 9 months later, Grace Carter Miller was born, the great-granddaughter of the woman who had planted the seed for everything the family had achieved. On the day of her birth, David went to the memorial in the company lobby and placed fresh flowers on the bronze plaque. "Mom," he said silently, "your great-granddaughter is here, and I promise you she'll grow up knowing your values and your story." That night, as he cradled his granddaughter in his arms, David reflected on the journey that had begun 15 years earlier with a simple question. What was the full name of the first employee who worked at the company 40 years ago? The answer had been easy: Grace Miller Sullivan. But the consequences of that answer had changed not only his life, but the lives of hundreds of people. "Sweet granddaughter," David whispered to the sleeping baby in his arms, "when you grow up, you'll learn that your great-grandmother was an extraordinary woman who gave up a fortune to invest in her son's education, and that son learned from her that doing the right thing is always worth more than taking the easy way." Emily, recovering in bed, smiled at her father. "Daddy, do you think she'll have the same values as her great-grandmother?" "I'm sure of it," David said, "because values are passed down through generations. And our family will always teach that honesty, hard work, and caring for others are the most important things in life." Jennifer, standing by the bed, squeezed her husband's hand. "I'm proud of everything we've built, love. The company, the family, the values we've upheld." "We built it together," David said. "You, me, Emily, my father, Richard, all our employees. Grace planted the seed, but all of us nurtured it with hard work and dedication. 20 years after that first question, David was 62 and considering his retirement plans. Emily had taken over much of the consulting firm's management, and the company continued to thrive under her leadership. Little Grace, now 5 years old, was the joy of the family, a bright, curious girl who loved hearing stories about the great-grandmother she'd never met. "Grandpa David," Grace asked one afternoon, "why did great-grandma Grace give her money for you to study?" "Because she knew education was the best investment a mother could make in her child," David replied. "She chose to give me knowledge instead of handing me money." "And were you sad she didn't leave you any money?" David laughed. "No, sweetheart, because the knowledge she gave me was worth far more than any amount of money. It's what allowed me to build everything we have today. When I grow up, will I work at the company too? Only if you want to, but first, you'll study hard and discover what you love. Maybe you'll want to be a doctor like your mom, or an engineer like your Uncle Charles, or a lawyer like your Uncle Edward. Or could I be the company president like Grandpa?" You could, but remember, the most important thing isn't the title you hold, but how you treat people. That night, after Grace had gone to sleep, David and Jennifer sat on the porch talking about the future. "Do you regret anything that's happened these past 20 years?" Jennifer asked. David thought about the question. "I regret having lost so many years without knowing my father and my brothers, but I don't regret any of the decisions we made along this journey." "And what was the hardest decision?" "Accepting to split the company instead of trying to keep it all. At that moment, I could have fought in court and maybe gotten more, but I chose justice over greed. And was it the right choice?" "It was, because we built something bigger than a company. We built a family, a community, a legacy of values that will pass on to future generations." Jennifer held her husband's hand. "I'm proud of the journey we've taken together." "Me too, and the best part is it's not over yet. We still have so much to teach our granddaughter, so much more to build, and so many more people to help," Jennifer added. David smiled. "Exactly. The question Richard asked me 20 years ago didn't just change my life. It taught me that we can always make a difference in other people's lives when we choose to do the right thing." The end of the story. So, what did you think of this story of perseverance and family values? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us if you or someone you know has gone through similar situations. Do you think David made the right decisions? Leave a like if this story touched your heart and subscribe to the channel for more moving stories like this one.